Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma shalli ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. Our honorable guest, Mr. Farid, and a student from National University of Singapore. We have limited time to discuss about our big theme. Actually, big theme is knowledge and philosophy in Muslim society, but lately we combine with material from this book. So if you see this book, maybe you know, 2011 or 2012, yeah, Mr. Farid, published by Oxford University, and then 2 years later, yeah, by Prof, yeah, or this book, or another book, yeah, or another book. Okay, this book is published by Mizan, and for your information, this book is very, very interesting because sold out, after published, sold out, and you cannot find in bookstore in Indonesia. So actually you can buy from internet media from Singapore student. Okay, before we start our discussion, let's introduce our speaker. First, Professor Syed Farid Alatas, Department of Sosiologi, PhD from Johns Hopkins, 1991, Philosophy of Social Science, Sociology, Theory, Political Economy. Then Syed Farid Alatas is Malaysian national, Associate Professor of Sociology at National University of Singapore. He lectured at University of Malay in Department of Southeast Asia Studies prior to joining NUS. Research interests. His area interests are historical sociology, the sociology of social science, the sociology of religion, and interreligious dialogue. Among his recent book is Alternative Discourse in Asian Social Science, Response to Encounters. His book on Thoughts of Ibnu Khaldun is forthcoming in 2000. Later, yeah.
All information.
All information. Okay.
Already published.
Okay, already published. Maybe we don't know yet. Yeah. Okay, let's start our discussion. Before our discussion, I will give to Mr. Farid. But before that, for the idea of this book, the idea of our discussion is based on the problem of Islamic world, which is in Islamic world there is a lack of intellectual tradition. So that's why there are increasing extremism, fundamentalism, etc., etc. It is the basic idea. And from first speaker, Dr. Farid will explain more and detail about this problem based on this book, special based on this book. Yeah. Okay, time is yours for Mr. Farid. 15 minutes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. So I have 15 minutes to say something significant or important. No, it's okay. So I think this is not the place to go into the to a deep discussion on theory and concepts of Ibn Khaldun, because it would not be interesting for many of you if you are not specialists in Ibn Khaldun, and also I think we want to address the general theme of knowledge and knowledge and philosophy, and also the issues you mentioned. So I would like to talk about a few concerns or a few issues that we should be concerned with when we think about Islam and knowledge and society, and our society. Because the first thing is that our knowledge and our studies should be related to the problems we have in our society. And when we study a scholar like Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Rushd or Al-Farabi or Max Weber, whatever, any scholar, when we study a scholar, there are 3 things that we should be aware of. There are 3 things we should be conscious of. There are 3 things we should understand from the work we are studying, from the scholars or the thinkers we are studying. One thing The first is their theoretical approach. What are the theories and what are the concepts, what are the main concepts that are used by the theorists, which you have to understand. For example, what is the conceptual or theoretical foundation of their work? So for example, Ibn Khaldun's conceptual foundation, you have the concept of asabiyah, you have the concept of mulk, a kind of authority, you have the concept of alliance, hilf, wala, clientship, you have the concept of dawla. These are some of the basic concepts in Ibn Khaldun's theory. We have to understand the basic concepts and how the concepts are related to each other. The next thing is we have to understand the method of the thinker. When I say method, what I mean is the method of argumentation. Is the author using demonstration, induction, deduction? Is he using poetic method? Is he using a rhetorical method? This is important for us to understand because the strength of the argument of a thinker depends on the method he's using. Maybe during discussion we can go into more detail about that. Now the third thing I think is for me also very important. When we read Ibn Khaldun or Max Weber or Karl Marx or any thinker, we look at the methods and the theory, but we also look for certain points, certain words of wisdom, certain claims, which are maybe not part of the theory. They may not be part of the theory, but there are points for thought and discussion which are very important. Do you understand what I'm saying? See, an author may have a theory about something, but in his book, in his writings, he may mention other things which are not directly related to the theory. And he doesn't go into the details about those things. But they are still very important. For example, Ibn Khaldun's theory is about rise and decline of states. But there is one point, one of the points he made about government is very interesting. He said that governments are, as a rule, unjust. A very interesting idea. Ibn Khaldun said that the general rule is that governments are unjust. So Ibn Khaldun, unlike many other thinkers, believed that just government is a bit difficult to attain. And he believed that it is only in the early days of the Khulafa that you have justice. And after that, there is a decline. There's a decline in governance, such that it is very rare. Only now and again, in certain periods, you may find a just government or a just ruler. So, for the most part, he believes governments are unjust. Now, I found that view very interesting because thinking about our own situation in Malaysia, also Indonesia, and many countries in our region, Philippines, and of course the Muslim world, I was thinking about this issue, trying to get this lesson from Ibn Khaldun, that as a rule governments are unjust. But the problem is, in political science, in political sociology, we believe the assumption is that governments are legitimate. There is an expression, legitimate authority. This is how political science defines governments. In Malay, they say keabsahan, kewibawaan. I think in Malay we say authority, the legitimate authority. Yeah, the assumption when you study any political science text or political sociology text, the assumption is that the state is legitimate, has a legitimate authority. The state, the government rules not by force but by authority, right? The state rules according to kewibawaan, not according to paksaan, because you do not need to force. If people believe in you, people believe in the government as legitimate, then they will follow your leadership without you having to force them. That's the difference between authority and force. So this keabsahan, legitimate, the legitimacy of the authority is the basis. But you see, this is in the textbook. This is in the textbook. And this is true of European states, of Western states, in the way that they have developed. Through, democratic processes, transparent rule, accountability. So we can say most of those states have legitimate authority. But then we think about Ibn Khaldun. He says most governments are unjust. And we think about our own country. I do not talk about Indonesia. I talk about my own country. Especially nowadays in Malaysia. It's been for that a long time, but nowadays we have a corruption scandal. You all know the story of 1MDB. And we have, become very much in the news because of this corruption, this accusation of corruption against people associated with 1MDB. So it seems to me that the basic assumption that the state is legitimate is problematic. Yes? Now, if we want to study a state that is not just, a state that is corrupt, and we don't accept the basic assumption that the state has authority that is legitimate, how do we study the state? If we take the view of Ibn Khaldun that governments are as a rule unjust, it seems that the best field to study the state is not political science. Because political science is about legitimate states with legitimate authority. But for my country, and I suppose for many Muslim countries, the correct field to study the state is criminology. Because the concepts that you need to study our type of states are from criminology. If, as a rule, our states are not just or they are corrupt, how do you study corruption? Corruption is a form of criminality, right? If the dominant means of governance is based on corruption and other forms of criminality, then you need the concepts from criminology to study the state. And indeed, in sociology, there is a concept of kleptocracy, negara kleptokratis. Yeah, I'm sorry?
Negara maling.
Negara maling, yes, that's right. Yeah. But then you see this maling, the thing is, we always have, thieves, right? Maling. I remember I spoke about this in Jakarta about 10 years ago, about negara kleptokratis. Yeah? And then it was reported in one of the Indonesian newspapers that Professor Alatas akui negaranya maling. I mean, as if they are so, the newspaper was so happy to know that, in Malaysia is also negara yang maling, because everybody used to talk about Indonesia as maling. So now, but the thing is, there is always maling, there's always corruption in all states. Even in Singapore there is corruption, right? But it is very much controlled. But a state becomes a kleptocratic state when corruption is dominant. When we say corruption is dominant, it means corruption becomes the major means of capital accumulation. Pengumpulan modal, that is the main way of accumulating capital is through corruption, through bribery, through nepotism, and through extortion. And Ibn Khaldun actually discussed corruption and domination of business by the state as one of the indicators of the decline of the state. Because when the state dominates business, the private sector is suppressed. When the private sector is suppressed, the private sector cannot pay tax. When the private sector cannot pay tax, the state loses revenue. When the state loses revenue, it loses its authority and its ability to rule. And eventually, the state is conquered by tribes outside who are stronger militarily. So there's a cycle. So the issue of governance, of corruption, is very important in Ibn Khaldun's theory. Now, so I've said that when we look at the work of a scholar like Ibn Khaldun, there are certain lessons we can draw from some of their statements. Like just the statement Ibn Khaldun said about governments are as a rule unjust, right? And this brings us to the idea of kleptocratic state, negara kleptokratis, the criminology of the state, and so on. Now, of course, we also are interested in Ibn Khaldun because of his theory of state, rise and decline of states. And I'm not going to go into those details now. What I want to say in the remaining time that I have left is the background of why I was interested in Ibn Khaldun, because this might be of more interest to you. When I was, a young boy, about 5-6 years ago.
You were young?
Huh?
50 years ago, maybe. When I was a teenager, my father, I suppose some of you know, was a sociologist, and he wrote a little book on Ibn Khaldun, but it was never published. Inshallah, one day I hope to publish it. He wrote a small book on Ibn Khaldun. It's in the form of a manuscript in English. And this was written when he was a student, a master's, I think, maybe a late undergraduate or a master's student in the University of Amsterdam. So this was an introduction to the thought of Ibn Khaldun. So I had looked at it, I tried to read it. I couldn't understand it very well, but I became very interested in the name Ibn Khaldun. It was some interesting sounding name to me. So it was in the back of my head. When I went to university to study, I would often come across the name Ibn Khaldun in my readings and in some classes. But I didn't do any serious reading on Ibn Khaldun. When I finished my studies, when I finished my PhD, I started to take more serious interest in Ibn Khaldun, partly because when I was a student, we in Malaysia and Indonesia, and more so in Indonesia, but even more so in India, in Iran, in Turkey, in the Philippines, there was developing dialogue, discourse or discussion about the problem of Orientalism and Eurocentrism. See, when I was an undergraduate student, Edward Said's book had just come out on the critique of Orientalism. when I was a young, doctor, PhD, I got my PhD, there was much discussion about the problem of Orientalism, the problem of Eurocentrism in sociology and other social sciences, especially in the Philippines. But to some extent in Indonesia, there was some discussion about the need to indigenize, mempribumikan ilmu pengetahuan, to indigenize the different branches of social sciences. So Ibn Khaldun was interesting because Ibn Khaldun is an example of a non-European, non-Western source for social theory, for social science. So I started to take more interest in Ibn Khaldun. I published some articles on Ibn Khaldun, and whenever I traveled, especially to the Middle East, I used to go to Iran, to Tunis, to Egypt, and also some trips to Europe, to Netherlands and to the UK. I would collect materials on Ibn Khaldun until I developed a good collection of books on Ibn Khaldun and by Ibn Khaldun, and also many articles. For example, one time, many years ago, I was in a Catholic organization in Tunis, a Catholic organization called the White Brothers. The White Brothers it was called. It was a French Catholic organization. They in Tunis. They had in the center of Tunis. They had a very nice building, Tunisian architecture, with a very small library. And this library specialized in in history and culture. And in this library, there was using a catalog. You remember the card? Those of you who are young, you don't know the catalog. Card catalog. You know what I mean? Catalog cards. You know those little cards with the title of books. When we were young, there's no computer. So you go to the library, you have the drawer. You open the drawer, and all the title of the books are in these cards. So I was looking, and all their books and articles, they put it in these cards. So I found so many things on Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunisia. So I was able to go to the Zaytuna mosque where he was teaching, and the house where he was born. And I collected so many materials in Egypt also. So I collected a lot of books and articles on Ibn Khaldun in Arabic, especially in Arabic, in English, and in French. But I had those materials for 10, 15 years. I didn't do anything with it. I wrote some articles, that's it. Then finally one day I decided to write a book about Ibn Khaldun. A book about the application of Ibn Khaldun's theories to certain cases. How do we use Ibn Khaldun to understand the rise of the Ottoman Empire? How do we use Ibn Khaldun to understand the rise of the Safavi in Iran, the Safavi Empire? And also, how do you use Ibn Khaldun to understand the rise of the Wahhabi state in Saudi Arabia? I was interested, how can we use Ibn Khaldun to understand, to apply, penerapan, menerapkan teorinya. So I wrote the book, and then I sent it to Oxford University Press, because Oxford University Press had a series, Makers of Islamic Civilization. They published books on Al-Biruni, not Al-Biruni, I think they have a book on, I can't remember, At-Tabari, on Syed Nursi, and a few thinkers. So it's a series. Each book will be on a certain thinker. So I thought maybe they will be interested in Ibn Khaldun. So I sent the manuscript to them, and then they said, the book is okay, but we do not want to publish a book on application of Ibn Khaldun's theory. We want a book on the life and thought of Ibn Khaldun. So then I said, okay, I'll write a book on the life and thought, because I did the book on application, And I collected so much material, and I knew a lot in my head about Ibn Khaldun. So I said, okay, I'll write now a book on the life and thought of Ibn Khaldun. So what I'm trying to tell you is, I wrote this book accidentally. My intention was to write one book on Ibn Khaldun on the application of his theory. But then the publisher was not interested, so they said we want something on the life and thought. So I then wrote on the life and thought. I think I took about 6 months to do it, and I sent it to them. Then, meanwhile, I have the other book, Application of Ibn Khaldun's Theory. So I sent that to another publisher, and it was published. So, I have accidentally, unintentionally, 2 books on Ibn Khaldun, which I know I'm very happy about. But I'm finished. It's a bit boring, eh? Okay. But usually when we talk about our theories and our concepts, but it's nice and maybe more interesting to talk about the background, right? Shreya? What I want to say is this. What I realized from the experience is that I started collecting materials on Ibn Khaldun for about 25 years. 25, less than 30 years. I started collecting materials on Ibn Khaldun. I never thought that I would have the interest or the ability to write 2 books on Ibn Khaldun. But I just was interested to collect the materials and to have the books and the articles about Ibn Khaldun, right? But many years later, 20, 25 years later, when I wanted to write the book on Ibn Khaldun, fortunately I had all the material in my house, in my home library. It's very lucky because I cannot find it in the library in the university. You cannot find Arabic materials. And a lot of French materials you cannot find also. So I was lucky. So my advice is like this. When you see something interesting, collect it. Collect it and don't think about how you are going to use it in the future. Just collect it. Don't worry about, is it useful, is it not useful, will I use it, will I read it. Don't worry, are you going to read it, if you're going to read it or not. Collect the material and keep it. One day you may use it. Yes. You will find it beneficial for yourself. This was my experience. So let me just end by saying that the most, I think, Ibn Khaldun is an example of how we can draw on our tradition to be creative in social science. How many of you, anyone studies sociology here? What fields do your students study?
Islamic philosophy.
Islamic philosophy. And Tasawwuf, okay, alright. You see, the thing is this. If you are studying, in fact, well, let's say for example philosophy. If you pick up any textbook on history of philosophy, it says history of philosophy. For example, there are so many, Alfred Weber, Windelband, A.K. Roger, and many other classical, books written on history of philosophy 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 80 years ago. Any book on history of philosophy, even those history of philosophies written in Indonesia or in Malay, it is actually history of Western philosophy. Right? History of Western philosophy. Yeah. Mainstream means Western. This is the problem. If you pick up a book on the history of social theory, it's actually history of Western social theory. But they say history of social theory. Yeah. So the problem with the thinking is that the Western is regarded as mainstream. This is the problem. And this is one of the results of Orientalism. So we want to balance the concern by looking at our own traditions. And when I say own traditions, I don't mean only Islamic. For example, Indian thinkers 100 years ago were thinking about society, systematically thinking about society, but nobody in the West considers India as an origin of social theory. But this is wrong. This is very wrong. The first social thinker in Nusantara, who is he or she? Nobody knows. If I ask you, who is the famous social thinker from Europe, do you know? Everybody knows, Durkheim, Weber, Marx. But we are living in Nusantara, we are living in in Southeast Asia. Who is the first social thinker of Southeast Asia?
Living?
No.
Living?
No, not living.
You are?
Same period as Durkheim or Marx or
I can
Weber.
mention Sultan Takdir.
Okay, so Sultan Takdir Al-Shabana, that's what the name I was trying to mention, I remember last night. Sultan Takdir, he talked about Nusantara. Okay, so in Indonesia you know Sultan Takdir Al-Shabana. In Philippines nobody knows. Even in Malaysia, people haven't heard. Maybe older generation. But our students, I think, have not heard of Sultan Takdir Al-Shabana. Am I right? Amir?
Of course. Sastrawan.
Yes, I know. I met him when he was alive. I met him when he was in the Jabatan Jurusan Asia Tenggara in Universitas Nasional.
Yeah.
Our young generation in Malaysia, they would not know Sultan Takdir Al-Shabana. In Philippines, in Thailand, they would not have heard of Sultan Takdir Al-Shabana. But everybody has heard of Durkheim, Weber, and Marx. Right? Okay. The first social thinker, the first person in Asia Tenggara to think systematically about society was Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal.
Oh, Philippines.
Yes. Jose Rizal. So this is why I'm saying we have to be concerned, to be interested in our own tradition as a source of ideas and concepts. So Ibn Khaldun is an example of that, right? Because we are not saying that Marx and Weber is not relevant. Like in philosophy, you study Islamic philosophy, but you believe that Kant and Heidegger are relevant. If you want to study modernity, it's important to understand Heidegger. It's important to understand Nietzsche. It's important if you want to understand the critique of, nihilism and secularism and so on. It's important. But we don't neglect our indigenous tradition. So Ibn Khaldun, we are interested in Ibn Khaldun because we want to to look at our own tradition as a source of ideas and concepts. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.